Okay, here's the good news. A few days ago, yes, you, landed a job at Google. Even better, it's not the Google we know and don't particularly like today. It's Google from the 2000s. The Google. The company every single nerd in the world dreams of working for. Their offices aren't a mess of white and gray, and they don't even have cubicles. They just opened this new product called Gmail to the public, and their slogan is, "Don't be evil." Will there ever be a company cooler than that? So you're in the office, ready to do some amazing things, ready to fulfill your corporate potential. Sure, you just agreed to work around Christmas when most of the company's on holiday, but it's a small sacrifice you're ready to make. And the work is just amazing. For example, on some days, you go full retro. Today, you're using an antique, Internet Explorer 6 on Windows XP for testing. You open your Gmail, which is still full of the introductory stuff the company sent you. All these newsletters, all these RSS feeds. Don't you wish you could read them all? So much amazing information. You will so use all of it in your work. And that's it. You've just been hacked. Not only you, the entirety of Google. This website contained an exploit. It infected your computer with a Trojan called Hydrack. An Internet Explorer vulnerability was used to execute malicious code on your computer. The code is simple, really. All it does is download a dropper from a command and control server and obfuscate it so that your administrator won't notice anything. He's on holiday anyway. The whole campus is maintained by a skeleton crew of a few unlucky souls like you. The dropper fires up a DLL, a backdoor, and deletes all traces of itself. If you press Ctrl-Delete, you can see it running in plain sight. Have you ever seen this service? Of course you did. But now, it doesn't do what it's supposed to. It keeps in touch with the command and control server all the time, 24/7. It's ready to receive a command, and that command can be almost anything. Escalate privileges, send data, even take control of your desktop when you're not looking. There's no need to do that, of course, because the attackers already have what they need. The source code. Google's source code. You didn't have access to it. You aren't trusted enough, but some of your colleagues have it. They just got a message from you on MSN chat, and the message contained a link to the same infected page. The source code is stored in a popular code management system, and the attackers are already downloading everything from there. The hackers will spend the coming days keeping tabs on you and some of your colleagues, monitoring while they sift through the code and pick it apart bit by bit. They'll find everything. Holes, vulnerabilities, secrets, even that one surveillance backdoor which allegedly doesn't exist. Only a few days later will the admin notice that something's wrong. It will take even longer to investigate the intrusion and kick the attackers out. Through you, Google just became a victim of Operation Aurora, one of the most ambitious cyber espionage operations ever. You will not get to keep your job, but not because the company has a grudge against you. In a few months, things will change. Geopolitical things, global things. One click you did, one click, will turn the world upside down. There will be no rollback. To understand this story, we have to briefly talk of something completely different. Cyberpunk. It's a subgenre of science fiction, yes, but it's also a philosophy, a sort of style of thinking. It was shaped in the 1980s out of disillusionment and sheer disgust with the corporate and political environment at the time. You know, this kind of environment. Cyberpunk was a call for common people to resist, but not by staging a revolution or getting into wacky New Age spiritualism as the previous generations did. It was a call to resist by embracing an inseparable part of that corporate world: technology. In cyberpunk stories, heroes turn technology against their corporate overlords, corrupt governments, and even against itself. They resist the establishment with cyberpunks. Saying that cyberpunk philosophy had an influence on hacker culture is an understatement. For decades, hacker culture was cyberpunk philosophy. For some, it still is. From cheesy 90s hackers movies to Anonymous, cyber attacks were the weapon of reclusive anti-heroes operating below the law. Even today, lonely punks are the first to blame when a cyber attack happens, despite the fact that very few cyber attacks are perpetrated by lonely punks. At least, not the cyber attacks that matter. You see, sometime in the 90s, after being continuously hacked by those punks, The governments and the corporations began to understand that cybersecurity is important, that the same weapons used by anti-establishment rebels can be used to enforce the establishment, even to fight other establishments, in particular if those establishments are perceived as stronger. That's when the idea of cyber warfare was born. Well, it was born a bit earlier, but only in the 1990s, after being popularized by the entirety of popular culture, it became mainstream. Cyberpunks could conquer the planet by hacking it. Why couldn't governments do the same? Employ some of those cyberpunks, train some more of them, harness the power of cyber by separating it from the punk. We know that the government saw it like that because a lot of people who worked for the governments wrote a lot on this subject in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. Books about information warfare were printed, read, and studied by countless important people in their fancy cabinets. Books about a new kind of war not restricted by geography, economics, and international laws. Books like these. Yes, a lot of these books were Chinese. A lot. Because by the end of the 20th century, China saw itself as an underdog, as a punk that was trying to challenge the established order. This worldview gave birth to the first generation of China's information warfare advocates, people who were interested in fighting what they called American hegemony with the same tools that helped the punks challenge it. People who called for China to become cyberpunk. In these books, they laid out strategies and tactics of how an information war could be waged, how China could leverage cyberpower to bargain for a better position on the international stage. They openly urged the Chinese government to perform cyber espionage, industrial espionage, influence operations, you name it. The Chinese government took this advice to heart, and it didn't take long for operations like these to be launched, and then called out by the other countries. Of course, China denied it, which led to a bit of a funny moment. China has never hacked anyone. There's a high chance that as Xi Jinping's speechwriter wrote these words, one of these books was on his table. Books that spent entire chapters saying that what the Chinese government should do right now is hack everyone. To be very fair, China was not the only, and even not the first country to dabble in information warfare. As its operatives were just beginning to experiment with this new concept, a full-on information warfare was already being waged in the rest of the world. The US, Russia, and some other countries already had multiple dedicated cyber espionage teams and were using them on each other, and even China itself. We did videos on a lot of these operations in the No Rollback series. You can find all of them in the playlist on our channel. Check it out after you finish this video. If you enjoy that type of content, like, subscribe, and share it with a friend. That'll help us fight the establishment of YouTube's algorithm a lot. Thanks. Anyway, one glance at the hacking operations some countries performed in the 90s and the 2000s is enough to understand that, in a sense, China was a bit of an underdog here. A bit of a cyberpunk. It didn't have the resources or the espionage know-how other countries brought with them from the Cold War, and its computer science field was practically non-existent. Lucky for China, a lot of very smart people spent a lot of time thinking on how to make the best of this situation. And that's how Operation Aurora began, the hack that took down one of the largest tech giants with just one click. There are two theories on why it started, the realistic one and the, let's say, the more esoteric one. We'll start with the realistic option. In 2010, the Cablegate leaks happened. WikiLeaks published a trove of classified messages sent by American embassies and consulates to the mainland. Those messages were never intended to reach a wide audience and contained a lot of sensitive data American spies and diplomats shared among themselves. One of the cables included a curious story. From what we know, it originated with Kai-Fu Lee, the president of Google China. He told it to Dan Pakuta, the head of the U.S. Embassy in China, in a private telephone conversation. Then it was included in a sort of briefing intended for the American intelligence community and leaked with a bunch of other cables. The story goes like this. Supposedly, one day in 2009 or so, a high-ranking Chinese official, the member of the Politburo Standing Committee Li Changchun, decided to Google himself. He went to Google China, the website which more or less complied with Chinese censorship requirements. He entered his name. The results were what he expected. Recognition and praise of his noble spirit and selfless devotion to the glorious cause of the great Communist Party. But then he noticed a different link, which was displayed right there on the Chinese page, google.com, the worldwide version of Google. Li clicked on the link. Then he entered his name into the search bar and pressed enter. One glance at the search results was enough. Fire surged up in his chest. A few of the results were somewhat critical of him. Critical. The official's horror had no bounds. According to Chinese law, criticizing officials of his caliber was strictly disallowed. It was prosecuted under the criminal law as subversion of state power and slander, and many a Chinese citizen got lengthy prison sentences for saying that maybe some government officials aren't doing that good of a job. But now these kinds of claims were directly in front of Li, easily accessible to anyone willing to click on one link. Li was furious. He immediately contacted the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, the State Council Information Office, and Public Security Bureau, and demanded to intervene with Google's illegal activities at once. This was in the midst of an already raging battle between the Chinese government and Google, in particular, Google China, which refused to take down the link to the uncensored worldwide version and was not very cooperative with its government in other areas too. So the government decided to act by other means. Another leaked diplomatic cable claims in the coming months, the State Council Information Office coordinated a giant cyber espionage campaign on Google, something that was supposedly confirmed by two independent sources within the Chinese government. The attack was political. China wanted to know Google's secrets to fight it better. The story of one enraged official launching a personal vendetta on Google is quite catchy because, well, it's a good story. We also know that it's not entirely true. The part with Li Googling his name and being horrified might be true, but it was definitely not the trigger for Operation Aurora. Because by that point, the operation was several years in the making. Targets were being researched, and custom malware was being written. A folder named Aurora was already created on the computer of some person, and perhaps the first Western companies were already penetrated by a Trojan placed in that folder. Companies other than Google. We will explore these details slightly later, but for now, if an official's fury wasn't the trigger to launch the operation, then what was? Here comes the second answer to that question, the one which might sound a bit esoteric. The Chinese books on information warfare have a concept which is hard to translate into English. Shi. It's something like strategic advantage, but the one you get through knowing more about the battlefield than the enemy does. Yes, a lot of Sun Tzu's Art of War revolves around this concept. It describes how to correctly evaluate the situation you are in and get the most out of it. How to obtain Shi. If you know how to read the environment, how to spot choke points and potential traps, how to stay well positioned while forcing your enemy to overextend, you are obtaining Shi. Get enough of it, and you won't have to engage in battle. The enemy's army will disintegrate. You will win without fighting. Just like many other lessons from the art of war, Shi was perfectly adapted by the Chinese authors who wrote about information warfare, but they added a bit of a twist to this concept. According to them, this is not only about military strategy. War does not stop at the edges of battlefields. It does not stop anywhere. Everybody is an enemy, and everything is a battle. An underdog that wants to win against the establishment has to embrace this, to understand that the world is constantly in a state of total warfare, that peace simply doesn't exist. If you let your guard down for at least a moment, you'll be beaten, and nobody will even bat an eye. A chilling conclusion with a side of horrible, self-fulfilling prophecy, but a totally normal one to make when you turn a textbook on war into one of the core pillars of your ideology. With this in mind, the first true Chinese cyber operations began in the early 2000s. The first targets were Russian, European, and American military infrastructure, intelligence agencies, and defense contractors. The goal was obtaining military information. The methods were crude but effective. Nothing out of the ordinary in those early days. But why confine yourself to military targets? After all, everybody is an enemy and everything is a battle. Politics, economics, culture. Obtaining critical information in any of these categories will help you make far better decisions. Will give you Shi. This realization led to a shift in Chinese strategic thinking, and consequently, the kind of operations the Chinese government performed, Operation Aurora being one of them. The targets of this operation were around 20 companies and 14 other organizations, all of them keepers of massive trade secrets that could give China tremendous economic and political advantage. Adobe, Yahoo, ConocoPhillips, ExxonMobil, Northrop Grumman, and yes, Google. Before this operation, Nobody thought of them as an enemy that a state could go to war against, much less an information war. But imagine that you see yourself as somebody who was monstrously wronged, not just personally, but on the international stage. The whole world did that, an entire system of international oppression, and these corporations are just part of that system. And on top of that, these corporations hold massive quantities of important information, their research, their know-how, even the client data they handle. That's a lot of a lot of strategic advantage to take on the rest of the world, and maybe win. China didn't need an insulted politician to launch this kind of operation. Considering everything we know about its information warfare research from the 90s and the 2000s, it would be very strange if the Chinese government didn't launch something like Operation Aurora at some point. A crucial part of any hack is malware, the tools that do the job. The main malware people back in the day associated with Operation Aurora was called Hydrack. For a while, it was practically synonymous with the whole operation. You say Aurora, you think Hydrack. They were part of the same concept, and we'll return to why that was in a moment. A less-known fact is that Hydrack isn't exactly one tool, but two, a Trojan and a backdoor. One of them for breaking into the target system, and the other one for staying there. They were used either together or separately, depending on the target. Hydrack also had quite a few variants. After dissecting some of them, the researchers even managed to find a hard-coded start date of its development, 2006, almost 3 years before the first documented attacks. Aurora hackers spent up to 3 years developing their tools. Up to is quite important here. Despite a lot being known about Aurora, we don't really have a solid start date for these attacks. We know when the first of them were noticed, though. The earliest date was logged by a cybersecurity company called Symantec. According to a report it published, Hydrack was spotted in July 2009, almost a half a year before the attack on Google. Some reports suggest Symantec itself was the target, but it could have also been one of its customers, a company whose networks Symantec was protecting. In this case, we also know the attack vector, a textbook case of sophisticated spear phishing. An employee at either Symantec or its client company received an email with an attached PDF document. Hiding inside was a Hydrack, a Trojan which exploited a vulnerability in Adobe Acrobat, Reader, and Flash Player. Do you remember Flash? Back in the day, a good chunk of the internet ran on it. Videos, banners, interactive games, you name it. If it moved, it used Flash. What you probably don't remember is that Adobe's ever-popular PDF reader was also integrated with it, and allowing playing Flash media right inside your PDF files. Wasn't that neat? It wasn't. The application had a lot of problems, including major bugs. One of them was extremely serious. It allowed for remote code execution. If you opened an infected PDF file, instead of showing you a silly animation, it opened a backdoor for a malicious actor to issue commands to your computer. This is what Symantec saw in July 2009, an email, a PDF file, and a 0-day vulnerability in Flash. The computer got infected, Hydrack created a backdoor in the system, and allowed extracting files and monitoring the computer's activity. The use of 0 days is a dead giveaway that we are not dealing with regular run-of-the-mill hackers. Finding these vulnerabilities is extremely difficult. They can cost millions of dollars on the black market, and they're almost exclusively used by governments and militaries. Think of them as a cyber equivalent of nuclear weapons, incredibly destructive, incredibly rare, and way out of reach for your regular gangsters. And Aurora hackers didn't limit themselves to just one 0-day. In December 2009, they breached Google. The scenario we showed in the beginning of this video was a dramatization of what happened, an email to a Google employee, a link to an infected website, which exploited a 0-day vulnerability in Internet Explorer, a Hydrack Trojan, and a backdoor to take control of the device. According to Google, Patient Zero used a somewhat antiquated version of Internet Explorer, probably for testing purposes. At the time, millions of people across the world still ran Windows XP and its proprietary browser. So Google simply had to test its products with this outdated tech. And that's how the hackers got in. After taking control of the first computer inside the company, the attackers used it to send infected messages through MSN Chat, another now forgotten piece of software. Just a few messages like these, and the attack got deep enough to cause some real damage. At this moment, some of you are already hard at work writing a comment to put the blame on the victim. Well, all of that wouldn't have happened if everybody had proper cybersecurity, right? They should have known better. With Hydrack, this is just not the case. No amount of updating and cyber hygiene could protect from it at the time. That's the scary part of zero-day vulnerabilities. The attackers got into Google through an old Internet Explorer, but even the newest versions were still susceptible to the same vulnerability. Adobe Flash was widely known for its holy nature, but everybody still used it too. If you were alive in 2009, you probably used one of these programs at least once. And that one time would have been plenty enough for Aurora hackers to breach you. But wait, it gets even scarier. Several years after Aurora ended, Symantec published a report that revealed an interesting twist to the story. Turns out, Hydrack wasn't the only malware the Aurora hackers used. There was a second Trojan called Nade, and it was even nastier than Hydrack. It was a separate backdoor that allowed hackers to puppeteer an infected computer. That's what most backdoors do. Nothing unique in that. To disguise itself, Nade used a collection of stolen digital certificates, impersonating some legitimate software. Also, nothing new, besides the fact that getting those stolen certificates to work is no small task. The fun begins when you look at how Nade operated. It was sophisticated. Very sophisticated. It even used a unique communications protocol to ferry data to and from the victim. A whole communications protocol created specifically for this tool. Symantec claims that Nade wasn't used on regular victims. It was reserved for special occasions. If a victim was deemed as high value, if a special link had to be established to carry some extremely sensitive, hard-to-get data, Nade would be used. Later attacks led the researchers to believe that Nade wasn't even operated by regular hackers who worked with other kinds of malware. There was a special subgroup, a separate team of super elite, super skilled operators who would be dispatched to handle the cases where Operation Aurora uncovered something that needed special attention. A cybernetic Tier 1 unit for the cases when your regular elite hackers just wouldn't do. Also, Nade wasn't discarded after Operation Aurora concluded, as Hydrack was. Nade's use continued. It was used to breach lots of other targets, mostly American military contractors, for at least 2 more years. It became the basis for several new Trojans used by various related hacker groups. Only in 2013 did the researchers reveal that the activity of this ultra-elite group of hackers with their incredible tool began with Operation Aurora. All right, we know how the operation was performed, but what about its goals? As far as we can tell, Operation Aurora had at least several objectives. When it comes to Google, what hackers immediately went for was the source code, the foundational piece of intellectual property and the crown jewel of any IT company. Some reports suggest it was the same with other breached corporations. The hackers went straight for the jewels. Now this is where we can blame something on security oversight. These heists were possible because lots of companies kept their source code in software configuration management systems, SCMs. Perforce SCM was one of them. In fact, it was wildly popular, almost an industry standard. Google used it, and lots of other companies did too. SCMs weren't really secure. Perforce definitely wasn't. Its whole point was to make access to the code as easy as possible to lots of employees, sometimes regardless of whether that access was actually needed or not. So by compromising just some lower-level workers, the attackers could get access to the company's entire codebase. Again, we know that this is what was done to Google, and we can infer that it works similarly in other breached companies, such as Intel or Adobe. There's another bit of information that kind of proves that. After Operation Aurora concluded, the hackers who conducted it suddenly became extremely proficient in finding and using 0 days. In 2009, during Aurora, they used 2. In 2011, the same group was caught using 3. Doesn't look like much, but that's 3 out of 8 0 days exploited by hackers in total. And in 2012, the use of 4 0 days was attributed to the group behind Aurora. Remember, usable 0 days are the nukes of the cyber world. They're impossibly rare and cost millions of dollars. The fact that one hacker group would suddenly amass so many of them is weird to say the least, or just shows that said group found an easy way to find those 0 days. Getting access to the source code would be one such way. It would make looking for 0 days much easier. This may serve as proof that Aurora hackers got their hands on a lot of source codes. What else did these hackers do after breaching their targets? We don't know much, but from their heists of source code, we can presume that they were very interested in intellectual property in general. Well, they had a whole super elite team specifically dedicated to exfiltration of the most secret and hard-to-reach information. They also breached a bunch of rather boring-sounding companies that worked on boring, real-world stuff, such as ExxonMobil, Dow Chemical, and Morgan Stanley. Their crown jewels, besides their source code, would include entire catalogs of tech a growing economy would love to get its hands on. Another thing we know Aurora hackers did to Google is attempt to use its access to client data, in particular, Gmail. 2 email accounts of Ai Weiwei, a prominent Chinese dissident and activist, showed signs of attempted access. After breaking into the accounts of Google employees, the hackers tried to get to regular Gmail users, in particular, those that sparked the interest of the Chinese government. There's even a claim that this was done by finding a special government backdoor in Gmail, the one Google would use if court ordered to spy on its users. There's no evidence to back that up, though. Not because Google wouldn't do that, but because we simply don't have the evidence. In any case, Google says the attempted break-in didn't succeed, and the Chinese government subsequently got access to the dissidents' Gmail accounts by phishing them directly. Lastly, there's one more claim about what Aurora attackers did in the breach networks. According to a former high-ranking Microsoft employee, the hackers were particularly interested if IT companies had received wiretap orders on some of their users. Those users were suspected Chinese spies in the United States. The story was later confirmed by multiple US officials, who added that the attackers may have also tried to tamper with the wiretapping systems themselves. So, in addition to IP theft and spying on dissidents, the hackers were running a counterintelligence campaign, trying to figure out if American 3-letter agencies got suspicious about Chinese spies, and if so, help those spies get out of danger. Remember what we talked about the strategic advantage? Get to know the battlefield, and you're miles ahead of your enemy. There's no telling how wide of a battlefield Operation Aurora scouted, from IT to politics to spycraft to IT data that would help with said spycraft. Aurora wasn't just a case of information warfare, it was an information offensive of yet unheard proportions. But there's one more detail revealed by research into this operation, a detail that has a hard time fitting into the idea about Aurora you might have just constructed in your mind. From the reporting of Google, Symantec, and others, it may look like this operation was planned, organized, and conducted with military precision. After all, it used 2 incredibly advanced pieces of malware, 2 hard-to-get vulnerabilities, and the infiltration tactics that left the victim no chance to escape, as if all of that was the work of a real military, which, as far as we can speculate, it quite probably was. But it also was, and please forgive us for the contradiction here, punk as hell. Not because the hackers challenged the authority of global megacorporations, no. Because people behind Aurora used some tactics and strategies that would put cyberpunks from the 80s sci-fi stories to shame. And here's what we mean by that. Malware is not the only thing you need for a successful cyber attack. You also need infrastructure that would support your offensive. Think of it like the supply chains, the ammunition factories, and the communication networks behind a real army. You may have the best soldiers in the world, but they are not going to fight much if you can't provide them with things like food, bullets, and orders. A crucial part of the infrastructure is command and control servers. The servers that, you won't believe it, command and control the malware and the targets it infects. This commanding and controlling is usually done through domains, sort of websites that connect the malware to the servers. Now, a cybersecurity company called Damballa was lucky enough to get its hands on a lot of DNS data sent by command and control servers that controlled and commanded Aurora. The whole process of how that was done is quite complicated, but the gist of it is that some of the data that traveled between the servers and the infected machines through known malware-associated domains was logged by special data collecting beacons. This data was massively incomplete, but it showed a very weird side of Operation Aurora, a side that didn't match with the military espionage stuff at all. The first attack, directed by Aurora's command and control servers, happened 2 months before the first disclosed use of Hydrack, on May 2, 2009. And Hydrack wasn't the only thing controlled by those servers. In the coming months, they controlled 5 more types of malware. And compared to what we previously discussed, that malware was just something else. It had no creative backdoors, no fancy encryption algorithms. It was just straight up bad. One of these 5 families was a fake antivirus that displayed pop-up ads and redirected users to scam sites. Another one was a barely functioning keylogger, which looked like it was written by an absolute beginner. These 2 malwares, and 3 more like them, were controlled by the same server and used the same domains behind Hijack, yet they looked like the tools of petty cybercriminals who scam their victims with unconvincing phishing messages and try to swindle them out of Apple Cash or Robux. How do these 2 sides of Operation Aurora match? Should we think that it was conducted by just a punk in their mother's basement, who acted as an anti-corporate vigilante by day and an amateur cybercriminal by night? There are several better explanations for that, and although we are not, and probably will never be, sure of what is the real deal, we can make several well-educated guesses. The researchers behind the original report took a good look at this baby's first malware, the command and control servers, and the messages that were sent between them, and came to the conclusion: most likely, this was testing. After all, a lot of the initial traffic from those servers was bouncing inside China, Jiangsu, Hangzhou, Chongqing. The servers got particularly busy pinging computers at Hangzhou Institute of Electronic Engineering, using both the university's internal network and the local internet service provider to spread. In mid-July, they also began communicating with victims in Taiwan and the United States, and by December, there was a lot of traffic to and from Google's headquarters in California. But the early spread was exclusively within China, so maybe Aurora's attackers used some throwaway malware, low-level stuff written by some intern with a background in cybercrime to test their network, to see how well it worked and how good those command and control servers were at commanding and controlling everything. Then, when the real attack started, they moved on to real stuff written by elite hackers. But there's another explanation too. Imagine you are a state-sponsored threat actor, and you need infrastructure to attack your mortal enemy. How do you even go about setting up command and control servers, purchasing domains, and making other preparations for an attack? You can't build the data center in the backyard of your local military base and work from there. That's a no-go. But maybe instead of that, you can buy some existing infrastructure from people who maintain it for a living? Cybercriminals. People who would spread something like fake AV unironically, collecting ad revenue from the scams they pull off. There are some convincing arguments to suggest that the infrastructure behind Operation Aurora, the backbone that made its intrusions possible, was purchased from scammers. But then again, whoever attacked corporations like Symantec and Google didn't use that infrastructure in the same way. They ran their separate malware, the malware that was built with fundamentally different premises and spread by incredibly sophisticated means. It's like there were 2 Operation Auroras at the same time, a low-tech one and a high-tech one. Whichever of these 2 explanations above you choose to believe, there's no denying the people who organized this operation didn't work like regular state-sponsored hackers. They built their espionage operation on top of a cybercriminal background, like an international spy using the tricks he learned while pickpocketing as a child. Alright, so with all we just discussed, there are some real conundrums when it comes to Operation Aurora. On one hand, we have years of preparation, the use of multiple teams, and unique sophisticated cyber weapons, even zero-day vulnerabilities straight out of the NSA's playbook. On the other hand, we have script kiddie level activity on the very same command and control servers, and tools possibly purchased and possibly used by scammers. We have theft of trade secrets, source code, surveillance on dissidents, and even attacks on counterintelligence efforts, and then adware run by the same actors. Operation Aurora is weird, like cyberpunk weird. But then, remember China's view that it's an underdog, a rebel, a dark horse that has to rise against the hostile world to secure its position? Operation Aurora, with all its idiosyncrasies, seems exactly like something designed for this purpose. An information attack of unrivaled proportions organized by a rising power, an upshot that wants to be in the big league, but doesn't yet have all the means. By this point, the only thing they lacked was a super intelligent dolphin cyborg inside a fish tank. And maybe if Operation Aurora would have been allowed to run its course, we would have seen even that. Weirder things have happened in the world of cybersecurity. Okay, let's go back to Google again. It published a lot of exclusive information about Aurora, and basically kickstarted the whole talk about this operation. A person crucial in deciding to go public with it, and also instrumental in mitigating the attack itself, was Heather Adkins, Google's vice president of security engineering.
I remember very clearly, we had a security team, we had people who were doing logs analysis, and we didn't call it threat hunting then, but it would have been effectively threat hunting. And I remember they were all doing analysis at their desks, and I came back from kind of my last meeting of the day and found everybody sort of huddled around very excited, and they said, "You'll never believe what we found."
Initially, Google thought that it was an insider threat. A rogue employee worked with the attackers and gave them access to the company's secrets. Remember, some of the Aurora spread was internal, through infected MSN messages.
But, we dived into the first technical indicator we saw, and it became clear pretty quickly that we were dealing with something much more serious. And then once we ruled that out and put it together with that bigger picture, the attack graph that we were building, we could see just how quickly the threat actor was moving, how capable they were, and the kinds of techniques that they were using, in particular, finding something specific about how we had done something at Google, read our documentation very quickly, and then adapted themselves. So this was clearly somebody, an operator who knew Windows environments very, very well.
This was big. To tackle and even understand an intrusion of this magnitude, Heather's team needed help, and Google decided to partner with some other companies. One of them was Mandiant, a rising star in the cybersecurity world at the time. A few years later, Mandiant would get bought by Google wholesale, but in 2009, it was an independent company with a knack for navigating the tricky mazes of international cyber warfare. By itself, Google knew how to get its head around intrusions from regular hackers, the old-school cyberpunk kind. It knew how to manage attacks by organized cybercrime gangs too. But this? Custom malware? 0 days galore? This was something completely different.
At the time, a company like Google would not have used the word nation state. We didn't have this concept of nation state hacking. We knew that governments were hacking governments, but that's what spies do. So no surprise there. But the idea that a nation state would hack a private company was not in our vernacular, right? We did not, as an industry, talk about it in 2009.
Mandiant had some experience with cases like these, though. The kind of experience you keep in the deepest vault of your corporate secrets storage, but experience nonetheless. This case was different. Google wanted to go public with it, reveal to the world not only that it had been hacked, but the scope of that hack too. More evidence was needed. Google brought on more companies, one of them being McAfee, with its vice president of research, Dmitri Alperovitch.
I got a ping from an executive at Google, Heather Adkins, who I'd known. She wanted to talk. Before we could talk, we had to sign an NDA, non-disclosure agreement with Google, because they said that they needed to share some information that was pertinent to McAfee customers. She basically briefed us that there had been an intrusion at Google that they had detected the prior month. As they were in the midst of their investigation, they realized that there were other victims, including many McAfee customers, that were potentially compromised, and they wanted to work with us on this investigation, and they started providing some of the indicators of what had occurred.
In a few days, Dmitri will become one of the key figures in this story, but for now, the researchers needed to understand who the attackers were. So what were the reasons to suspect that Google was really hacked by a nation-state and not by a bunch of scammers who just got their hands on military-grade malware in 0 days? Google knew that the attackers were interested in Chinese dissidents. Also, the attack began in Google China offices. This seemed enough to implicate the Chinese government, which Google didn't have that great of a relationship with. You see, Google's attempts to break into the Chinese market weren't easy. We've already mentioned how they had to censor search results to comply with local laws, and how China bombarded Google with requests to restrict its operations even further. Google's executives regularly grumbled about how complying with the censorship compromises their mission. Supposedly, they only stuck with that because withdrawing from China altogether would compromise the mission even more. This was from the 2000s, the one with the famous motto and the executives that seemed interested in upholding it. There are even reports that Google tried to comply with the Chinese restrictions as little as possible, sometimes to a malicious degree. Google itself calls this speculation, but it's clear that at the time, trying to work with scores of various local restrictions was akin to juggling fireballs.
But I didn't work the operations side of that in terms of kind of mechanizing it every day. I will say, though, that, more generally speaking, China is not the only place where we were required to abide by local law with regard to search results. And it's a really complex landscape. If you have one jurisdiction saying do this, okay, by law you have to do that. Another jurisdiction has a completely different set of rules. And so you sort of have to build the product around these land borders. There's no land borders on the internet, as you know.
We can safely say that China wasn't too fond of Google either. The leaked US diplomatic cables made this very clear. In a few of them, sources with the Chinese government complain about the company, saying that it was considered as a massive annoyance, if not a direct threat. For the average Chinese internet user, Google was cool, youthful, shiny, and convenient to use, making Baidu, the local alternative, look bad in comparison. Even if Google's results were censored to a similar degree, they looked like forbidden fruit, exotic and attractive. Finally, there was the case of Li Chongqing, who possibly had a personal grudge after that one Googling incident. It might not have kickstarted the whole operation, but it definitely contributed to the tension surrounding it. So this was a mutual distrust bordering on hostility, and now on top of that, Google uncovered a hacking operation which had at least a few indicators tying it to China. For Google, that seemed like the last straw. It published a blog post titled, "A New Approach to China." And if we're talking about events that changed the history of everything, that was definitely one of them. In the post, Google spilled the beans, not only explaining how it was attacked, but how this was part of a massive campaign that infected at least 20 more large companies and reflected what could only be described as a larger policy shift in China, a shift towards censorship, hostility, and insulation from the outside world. The post ended with an announcement that, considering the circumstances, Google will now be negotiating its exit from the Chinese market. Now, this is how you make a statement. The announcement brought the attention of the media to the cyber attack and cemented Operation Aurora as something that targeted Google in particular, leaving dozens of other victims in its shadow. The Chinese government responded with what was, for many years, its standard template in these kinds of cases, a statement denouncing any and all cyber attacks and denying that the People's Republic of China is ever involved in them. It would be difficult to expect a different response. Admitting to such an attack would defeat the purpose, right? And so, another denial, made all the more ironic considering that China's strategy of information warfare was never a secret. But let's give it the benefit of a doubt. Could this statement be true? Could Google have been misled? As any cybersecurity expert worth their salt will tell you, attribution is hard. Maybe Google was too focused on its spat with China, and that it was just a dose of wishful thinking. A few weeks later was enough to understand that, no, the evidence tying this attack to China just kept coming. In a couple of days, numerous other companies came out with their own takes on the same operation. A few of them admitted to being attacked, and some put the blame on China. Information about even more victims slipped through anonymous sources, whistleblowers, and other kinds of reports. In the end, the names of at least 15 out of 34 victims became known. Apparently, not all of the victims were from the US too, as reports mentioned companies from the UK, Germany, Taiwan, and other countries also falling victim to the same malware. An even more significant twist might have come in 2013. In an interview, an employee from Microsoft gave a hint that the company was breached too, although he later retracted his statement. If this admission was true, Google wouldn't be the largest IT company swept up by Operation Aurora, but even a decade later, we don't really know. Another thing, spurred by Google's blog post, was an avalanche of research papers where cybersecurity analysts parsed through the traces of the attack and tried to extract every last bit of data from it. We've already discussed a lot of those papers in the previous part, but didn't touch on the most important of them. Remember McAfee being brought on the investigation soon after it began? Its effort led to a very important breakthrough. Apparently, the hijacked Trojan had an interesting detail. Deep in its code, there was a trace of the path where the file was stored on the hacker's computer. The group or the person who launched this attack kept it in a folder named Aurora Source.
I remember I was looking at the malware late at night in my home and seeing the string Aurora in the code and realizing that this had to be the name of this operation, which I ultimately named it Operation Aurora, because of the symbolism that was involved. Aurora, of course, having been born in Russia, I had appreciation for the Russian history, and Aurora was the name of the battleship that fired the first shot. There was a signal to Lenin in 1917 to start Russian Revolution. It's often been called the shot heard all around the world that changed the course of the 20th century with the spread of communism, first in the Soviet Union and then more broadly, and really beginning the Cold War that continued for the rest of that century. And I thought that this was going to be an incredibly consequential operation, at least for the cyber domain, if not for broader geopolitics. And it certainly proved to be the case. That was the first sign of what later I realized was another Cold War that we had been in with China.
No ambiguity here. Whoever the attackers were, they called their operation Aurora, and they may have even had pretty grand ideas about its eventual significance. Getting this amount of insight into the attack is quite unusual in the sphere of cybersecurity. Typically, we have no idea how the attack was called by the attackers themselves, and the names are given based on some cool-sounding but rather arbitrary collection of words found in the malware. This method was still used in Aurora's case too. Inspired by a curious snippet of code, Symantec called the hacker group behind the operation Elderwood. Other companies gave it more mundane names: Sneaky Panda, Beijing Group, SIG-22. Unlike with some other Chinese groups like Volt Typhoon, these names weren't memorable enough and never stuck. For years, the team remained known simply as the hackers behind Operation Aurora. Still, one of the most straightforward hints of where these hackers came from appeared just several days after Google's reveal. An engineer at yet another cybersecurity company, SecureWorks, noticed a very unusual feature of hijacked malware. It used a unique cyclic redundancy check algorithm. There are many versions of this algorithm. The attackers could have used any of them, but they used a very particular one, mildly popular in China, and never used anywhere outside of it. It was like a gangster leaving a ransom note and using a paper which can only be purchased in one particular bookshop. Could this indicator have been faked? Sure, just like any other one. But the indicators like this just kept piling up. In March, Damballa published its report with the intercepted communication between Aurora's command and control servers and the infected computers. It showed that the earliest spread was in China, and it looked a bit like the infrastructure for the upcoming attack was being tested there. Alternatively, the infrastructure could have been purchased from Chinese cybercriminals, a thing you would only do if you were deeply involved in the local cybercriminal scene. Could this have been faked too? Could the attackers have hijacked a bunch of Chinese networks, including one belonging to a prominent research institution, just to throw the investigators off track? Well, sure. But then the US government chipped in. It published a statement saying that Aurora's command and control infrastructure has been tied to two more prominent education establishments in China, Shanghai Jiaotong University and the Lanshong Vocational School. Both of these schools have close ties to the Chinese military and produce some of the finest hackers for the Chinese army. Also, these are not the networks Damballa noticed in its DNS tracking. Perhaps, at some point, Aurora's infrastructure saw significant expansion. Could this have been obfuscation too? Well, the staff from Shanghai Jiaotong University said that possibly the hack was perpetrated by some overly ambitious students who just wanted to have some fun after hours. More and more evidence denying that China is behind Operation Aurora became pretty much impossible. The truth is, this operation was massive, perhaps one of the largest and most ambitious cyber espionage campaigns up to that point. When you're writing several new families of malware, using entire networks of servers and employing scores of people, it becomes nearly impossible to cover all your tracks, be it a very specific version of an algorithm one of your programmers decided to use, or some traces of early testing, or the targets that will betray the source of your campaign in one or another way.
Look, attribution is only hard if you don't have a history of investigating these intrusions, if you have not spent months and years collecting various bits of data on what the adversary is doing. Over time, with every single operation, they reveal something about themselves. And if you have a comprehensive enough collection system, then over time, attribution becomes easier and easier because with every new intrusion, they can make a small mistake that in aggregate adds up to the full picture of who they may be. And so at the time, Aurora was kind of the first one that was being investigated in such a public way. So I would say the attribution was less easy, certainly for us, to get a high degree of confidence in. But over time, as we got to Night Dragon, certainly as we got to Shady Rat, you had all sorts of information that was now available to us that made it much easier.
These subsequent operations had a lot of similarities with Aurora. The use of derivative malware, or the same infrastructure, or even bits and pieces of code. In the case of Shady Rat, the hackers made some critical mistakes and researchers even managed to track their precise location. Nevertheless, those operations were very effective, and they owed their success to the first shot, Operation Aurora. That's where China's global cyber effort really began.
The world has certainly changed a lot in those 15 years, and one of the things that was amazing to watch at the time when we were publishing this information, when Google was publishing this information, is how much of the cybersecurity community was massively resistant to this idea that you could have nation-state operations in cyberspace, that if you did have nation-states operations, they had to look something like Stuxnet, where you had 6 0 days and targeting the Iranian nuclear enrichment facilities, but anything below that level of sophistication couldn't possibly be nation-states. So you had very reputable firms at the time, Kaspersky was one, and others, saying, no, this is not nation-state, this could not possibly be China, it's just a botnet, it's just hype from McAfee and Google trying to claim that this is something more than what it really is. And that continued for quite some time. I remember even during Shady Rat, Eugene Kaspersky went after me in a very personal way, claiming that I was making all this stuff up and that this was not all that sophisticated. It can't possibly be China. And of course, 3 years later, Justice Department indicts the same crew that was responsible for Shady Rat, and it turns out to be PLA officers, part of the Chinese military.
There were a lot of earlier indications tying this activity to the People's Liberation Army of China. For example, the leaked intelligence cables from the US embassies. According to them, sources within the Chinese government had a pretty clear understanding on why and how this attack was performed, and gave multiple overlapping reasons for it, from a high-ranking official with a vendetta to an all-out war with Google the Chinese government wanted to wage.
But it's important to remember that not everything you read in a State Department cable is necessarily true. This is the observation on the ground of, sources, and then they're interpreting. And I imagine if you are in the US government and you're getting all of this all the time, you're having to figure out what to believe and what not to believe. But having said that, I don't think we really know the impetus or the reason behind it. But one of our hypotheses is that they wanted long-term access to Gmail accounts. And we said this in the blog post up front. One of the reasons for that is that as we did the investigation, we also realized how much account hijacking there was going on with dissidents and journalists who were reporting on Chinese government activities. And we could see where those account hijackings were from and the nexus of that. So for us, it kind of really came down to what did we see their interest in on the network? What did we see them after? We think it was just a straight up espionage campaign. And we would see something very similar at Microsoft in 2023, including some of the same tactics.
What was true for Google may not have been true for other targets, though. Dozens of companies were breached, not only in IT, but also petrochemical, financial, and other industries. Only Google came forward with details of the breach. With other ones, the reasons for the attack probably differed.
Keeping in mind that what we see when we talked to the 20 victims is actually that we were one of the last in the chain, not the first. The campaign went back at least 2007, as far as we could see, when you looked at domain name registration, prevalence of the malware, and virus total, and things like that.
Which brings us to the things that tied this whole campaign together. It was centralized. That could easily be spotted through the domain names used by the malware. It was neatly organized and ordered, as if the people who performed it had a very clear idea of what they were doing and what goals they wanted to achieve. As if they looked at it as a battle that has to be won, a part of a total information war, like the piles of those books on officials' shelves suggested. Books that explain how China, an underdog on the international scene, has to find a way to turn technology against the establishment, the international order of countries and companies, all of them supposedly hostile to China to one or another degree. Everything is a battle, and everyone is an enemy. With this in mind, such a cyber attack makes total sense. a cyber attack that casts an impossibly wide net across Western corporate giants, squeezing every ounce of advantage that can be gained from breaking into their networks. From the moment when China shakes off its insecurities and rises up against what it saw as the hostility of the surrounding world. With this perspective, it's safe to say that Operation Aurora was one of the most important stepping stones toward the China we have now. The China which is still cyberpunk, but in a very different way. You see, even though the original meaning of this word conjures citizens rising up against their overlords with the help of technology, nobody really remembers that meaning nowadays. For most people, cyberpunk is not challenging the establishment. It's this. The aesthetic. The color of neon on your face as you walk through the futuristic streets of Shanghai. Looking at China today, it's difficult to imagine that it ever considered itself as a rebel rising up against the international order. In many parts of the world today, China is the international order. But it wasn't always the same. To get here, China had to win a battle against the rest of the world it considered and still considers hostile. Is this a good or a bad thing? A necessary crime? Something that had to be done? Or just a self-fulfilling prophecy? Because if you think that everyone is an enemy, making friends is just not an option?
And I do wonder in 100 years if we were to look back and look at where did Operation Aurora sit in this very big timeline, you'd see it kind of sits in this period of time where China really made a change of direction in terms of how they wanted to interact and operate in the world. Through the lens of hacking, you certainly see that as they then attack RSA in order to get into Lockheed much later. And then what we are witnessing right now here in 2025, which is a tempo and level of sophistication throughout critical infrastructure around the world that I don't think we could have ever predicted would be happening. I don't want to overplay the importance of Operation Aurora, but I do want to sort of say it sits in this time frame where we really see the world change quite a bit and the role of cyber having a more prominent place in geopolitics and even warfare.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, you can subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. That will help us grow and make more videos. Oh, and remember the playlist we have? Check it out and let us know what other hacking story we could cover in the next installment of No Rollback. See you in another video.